What is your guiding light? I got the idea for this topic when I heard a certain politician in Washington, D.C. say that the Bible says that government is appointed by God, so we should do what government directs us to do. The government, then, is our guiding light. Really? I have a smiley face here. This appointment by God implies that God is guiding this government. If only it were so. The person who said this, by the way, was Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, at the time. Clergy quickly set him right. It's a good idea for us to be clear on just what guides us. So, what do you determine to be your guiding light? We Unitarian Universalists are likely to look to our 7 principles for guidance, as well as to our conscience. We mostly quote our 1st and 7th principle, don't we? The worth and dignity of every person and the interdependent web of which we are all a part. But at this point in our history, the most important principle for me is the 2nd: justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. This morning, you heard the reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan. For those of you who don't know, I'd like to remind us that Samaritans in biblical times, and even now, were a despised group of Jews. They didn't observe all the religious rites and rituals, and so were considered low class. This parable is important enough in our times that there are even laws in most states called the Good Samaritan Law. How many of you have heard of the Good Samaritan Law? Oh, almost everyone. This law compels people to render reasonable aid in emergency situations. We can even be arrested for not rendering aid. As an aside, I noticed that Rhode Island does have a Good Samaritan law since 2012. And Governor Raimondo added to it this year, in 2006, to include help for drug overdose cases. In the last line of the Good Samaritan, the questioner responds to Jesus that the good neighbor was the one who had mercy on him. The word mercy in the Bible usually means forgiveness. But in this context, it means kindness. The Samaritan, though, wasn't just kind, he was extremely kind. Not only was he intimately involved in cleansing the wounds with wine and applying oil as a salve, but he took the man to an inn and had the innkeeper care for him. The Samaritan spared no expense to care for this stranger who was simply a fellow traveler in need. A modern version of this could be that we find someone on the sidewalk in great need late at night when the temperatures are below 0. We might give this person our coat, put him or her in our car, and take him to a hospital. Or at the very least, we may call 911 and keep him warm until help came. I want to propose to you that kindness is a simple and powerful guiding light for us in our challenging times. You may know that one of the 2 great commandments is to love your neighbor as yourself. So why not use love as a guiding light, you might ask. While you might not agree with me, I believe that loving your neighbor as yourself is complicated. Do we really love ourselves? People generally do not know what it means to love the self. People generally don't have a high regard for themselves. Does it mean that we should be selfish, thinking only of ourselves? Or does it really mean that we should be kind to ourselves? Are you kind to yourself? Using the word kind is much clearer than love. What do you think? Kindness or love? Or both, eh? How would we describe kindness? Perhaps the word kind conjures up for you warm-heartedness, friendliness and caring and concern. Thus it becomes a little word rich in meaning. I wonder if you saw the Dalai Lama, it was a few years ago now, on the TV saying, when he was asked what's his religion about, he said, "My religion is kindness." And then he giggled gleefully. If you've ever seen him, you know that he laughs a lot. Writer and psychologist Piero Ferrucci says, "My thesis is that true kindness is a strong, genuine, warm way of being. It is the result of interplay among several qualities such as warmth, trust, patience, and gratitude." He goes on to say that kindness is a major factor in our lives, and it has surprising power to transform us. Other experts say that we human beings actually need kindness. If we don't have kindness in our lives, we become depressed. When you are ill, you actually get better faster if someone cares for you in a kind way. Can you think of a time when someone was kind to you? Do you remember the circumstances? I asked myself this question and recalled an incident from my early 20s. I returned to visit my family in England, and I was dragging my suitcase along the railway platform in London, en route to Manchester. There were no suitcases on wheels in those days, remember? Suddenly, the suitcase burst open, and my clothes and gifts for the family scattered all over the platform. Probably seeing how stunned I was, a man took charge and organized the people around me to repack my suitcase. Even a ball of string appeared, and my things were packed and tied up with string, just in time for me to get on the train to Manchester with tears of gratefulness falling down my cheeks. I'll never forget this. It's like as if it happened yesterday. Do such kindnesses shape our lives? Many other instances occurred, but I think that was something so unusual. So I told you. We are more likely to recall vividly kindnesses received than we are kindnesses we have given. Perhaps this is why we don't have much self-love or appreciation for ourselves. Perhaps we are never good enough in our own eyes. So when you do a kindness for someone, please take a moment to reflect that you were just kind to someone. you made a difference in someone's life. Being kind to others and receiving kindness actually makes us happy. I hope you'll spend some time today reflecting on your own experience of kindness, and perhaps on planning to intentionally give and receive kindness and notice how it feels. The snacks that you bring to share for coffee hour are a kindness to the congregation. You take turns in bringing snacks. You take turns being kind. For many years, I had a bumper sticker on my car that I loved. It said, "Practice random acts of kindness and senseless beauty." Do you remember that? Yeah. I almost didn't sell that car because that bumper sticker was on it. I think it saved me from many a parking ticket, I can tell you that. But you have to choose your kindnesses well. Unlike this woman, one day, a woman saw across the street a very little boy trying to reach a doorbell. Wanting to help, she briskly crossed the street and crouched down beside the little boy, and she reached up and she pressed the doorbell, and she said, "Now what do we do, my little man?" And the little boy said, "We run." Seriously, though, a guiding light should function more than only change an individual. A powerful guiding light should be able to change or challenge the world. Let us test our guiding light of kindness. Let us take a gross injustice that exists in today's society and try to apply kindness to it. A recent one is the tearing of children out of the arms of immigrant parents. Was that kind? And this was defended by that same Attorney General, the very one that said God selects the government. No civilized society would have committed such an outrageous and cruel act. Our immigration laws need to pass the kindness test. Or how about following the law? What on earth will happen once the next caravan of refugees arrives at our border? I shudder to think. Now let us test acts of kindness with a very old injustice, racism. Last year, I joined a Confronting Racism book discussion group. We read many books. It covered the period from when slaves were set free until today. You can imagine that taking in this gruesome and unjust history was disturbing, to say the least. With the rise of the so-called United Right, alt-right, and white nationalists, and the disparagement of black football players and many other persons of color by our president, now is the time to truly understand this ages-old injustice. Statistics show that many, if not most, African Americans still live in ghettos and have not made the transition to owning their own homes like white Americans, like they did following World War II. Simply put, African Americans were not allowed to live with whites. They were segregated into crowded urban and suburban areas all over this land. North as well as south, their areas were redlined by the federal, state, and local governments. You can see these maps today in history books. The FHA was not allowed by law to lend to African Americans until the late 1970s. The late 1970s, folks. That was when we bought our first home. Was this constitutional? Absolutely not. But this fact was simply ignored. This is how the Jim Crow laws were allowed to exist in the South. They were not constitutional, but this fact was ignored. All of this is fully described in a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, a legal scholar. Our Constitution protects us, so it behooves us to follow it. Owning a home was and still is the major way families are able to build wealth. Add this to a disgraceful history of housing and job discrimination, and we have perpetuating ghettos in most urban areas of our country, including the Boston area. And perhaps you can tell me at coffee hour if this was so in Rhode Island. How many of you knew about redlining? Oh, almost everyone. Please tell me, how was it in Rhode Island? More recently, Boston has found ways to get poor people into their own homes. You know, what they do is they use a different calculation. They don't base, like most of us when we have to qualify, we have to show that we earn a certain income. And we have to have probably a pretty good down payment. But in Boston, they have a special poor people's program that they look at whether they paid their rent regularly, whether they paid their basic bills regularly. So that's what they looked at, responsibility. That's what they looked at. So this is for poor people, and I think this is fabulous. I mean, a state like Rhode Island, I would think that they probably would have such. But you tell me if you know. If we want to redress this terrible treatment of our African Americans, a kindness would be to do everything we can to ensure that special lending programs continue. I hope you will read about the historical scope of discrimination against African Americans and other people of color to redress the situation in small ways and large ways. The very least we can do is become a member of the NAACP and the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC. These organizations fight discrimination through the courts. And just an annual membership fee of $35 or $50 a year will strengthen these organizations. And what a far, far-reaching kindness this would be. You can get these addresses through Google. You can log on to Google and put NAACP and just ask for the membership, NAACP. By the way, white people have been part of these organizations since they were founded. They were founding members of the NAACP, including Unitarians. Perhaps in the aftermath of the current disastrous White House administration, we may have a better chance to understand and confront injustices of the past with greater effectiveness than before. Our conversations about racism are becoming less awkward, a good sign we're beginning to bridge the gap. In another year, we will have an opportunity coming up on Voting Day, 2020. Taking action for social justice is a far-reaching kindness, and we'll be living out our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. But let us now return to the subject of kindness in the more personal level. I hope that you can view every check that you write for charity, every offering that you have for charity, whether it be for this church, for the NAACP, Doctors Without Borders, Greenpeace, the ACLU, Mercy Ships, or whatever engages your heart. I hope that you can know deep down that it is a kindness that you do. Please become more conscious of this, and so become used to thinking of yourself as a kind person. Visiting someone who is ill or in the hospital is a kindness. Picking up someone and bringing them to church is a kindness. Every helping thing you do for others is a kindness. Also, you might have discovered already that your personal life is far more rewarding if you are treating your partner, spouse, friend, or companion with kindness, and you are receiving kindness from them. We cannot possibly be happy with others if kindness is not mutual. However, because we are human beings, there will always be times when we cannot feel kind because of anger or resentment. This is how life is, isn't it? What can we do when anger and resentment strike? Though Pema Chodron's words from the second reading this morning were meant to resolve large conflicts, perhaps between nations, they work just as well for individuals. She said essentially, the solution has to come from a change of heart, from softening what is rigid in our hearts and minds. The key is to notice when we are caught up in anger and resentment. Notice it, and then decide to make a difference to soften your heart. I find that putting my hand on my heart reminds me to do that. And then when you soften your heart, you soften your mind. And I'll be honest with you, I have tried this, and it works every time. Here we have it. Soften your heart and your mind when you notice your anger or resentment has taken over you. If you do, you will be restored to a kindness of being. Guaranteed. And don't forget to practice kindness at hospitality hour. Newcomers are open-hearted enough to come here and risk coming amongst us. Shouldn't we be open-hearted to them as well? Church is the safest place of all to practice kindness in hospitality. May no one stand alone. I hope you agree with me that kindness is the most powerful guiding light for the individual, the nation-state, and the world. Kindness is love in action. Love in action. So may it be amongst us.